Morning, Rabbosai. We're on the top of Daf Ayin Zion Amid Beis, and we'll just summarize what we need to know from Daf Ayin Zion Amid Aleph. And the Gemara tried to prove that our Mishnah would contradict the Shita of Rabbi Yeshua. And our Mishnah establishes that you bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. And the Gemara puts together a number of different premises, different principles, that if you accept all these principles, you cannot reconcile with the law of the Mishnah. Why? Because the first principle is that Tuma dechuya b'tzibur, not hutra but dechuya. And the second principle is that the tzitz must be maratza in order for us to apply the principle of Tuma dechuya b'tzibur. Tuma dechuya b'tzibur means that there really is an Isur Tuma when we bring this carbon. And the only way we can circumvent that Isur Tuma is with the Ritzi Tzitz. That's premise number two. Premise number three, which is simple, and that is that when you have a case of Tuma and you're bringing the carbon, the basar, whether it's the basar for the Imurim or the basar for the Achila, in the case of other karbanos other than Ola, cannot be tahorim. There's no way that you can have a basa that's royal achila, whether it's achilas mizbeach, achilas adam, if it's tameh, unless you have ritzit tzitz. And now we're holding that tzitz is not maratza al ha'ochlim. Tzitz can only generate a validity for the carbon itself, bituma, but not for the basa. The basa cannot be eaten bituma because we're holding now that the tzitz does not have the power to be maratza on the ochlim. It cannot convert, so to speak, transform the ochlim from tmeim into tahorim. So now the issue becomes whether or not you could bring a carbon and be zorik the dam, even without the achilas habasa. And here's where the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua derives from two different psukim that im ein basar ein dam, that there's no zrikas adam without the possibility of achilas habasar. If the basar is not royal achila, then the dam is not royal zrika. So if you turn together all these premises and all these principles, you come to the conclusion that there's no way you could bring the carbon b'tuma, because tuma dechuya b'tzibur, which means that we need tzitz, and the basar is going to contract tuma, and the tzitz cannot be marata on the ochlin. And now we're going to apply the principle of Rabbi Yeshua, ein dam below basar. That's where we're holding. Now, let's introduce another shita, and that's Rabbi Eliezer, which was the last thing that we learned on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, and he disagrees with Rabbi Yeshua, and he derives from the same pasuk that there is dam without basar, and that is because the pasuk says v'dam zvachecha yishafech. After mentioning at the beginning of the pasuk v'yasisa lasecha basar v'adam, this is in Dvarim Yud Beis pasuk Chav Zayin, implying that there's both basar and dam. Then the Torah says v'dam zvachecha yishafech, and that tells us that dam is independent of basar. So even though the Karban Ola is broad and it has both zrikas hadam and basar, as indicated by the reisha of the pasuk, but the continuation of the pasuk, the dam zvachecha yishafech, teaches me that the dam stands on its own even without the basar. So if the basar is not roy, neither to aktara in the case of Eimur, nor achila in the case of that part of the carbon that's nechal, then nevertheless we can be zarik the dam. And the issue is going to be how to reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yeshua, who says that im ein basar ein dam. So we're now up to Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Beis, all the way on top. And the Gemara now questions why Rabbi Yeshua would need two psukim in order to derive the conclusion that there's no Zrikas Adam if the basar is not roy. What are the two psukim? In truth, it's all one pasuk, but there are two parts to the pasuk. The first part of the pasuk says, "V'asisa olasecha habasar vehadam." From the fact that the Torah, in one breath, mentions basar and dam, we conclude that it's a partnership. It's haba atalyo. You need both basar and dam. And the Malbim, in his commentary on this pasuk, points out that it's very strange that the word basar is written before the word dam, because the dam comes first and then the achilas habasar comes second. And this was the basis, this question was the basis for Rabbi Yeshua's conclusion that you need the basar in order to have the dam. And the Torah deliberately put basar before dam to tell you that the dam depends upon the basar. And im ein basar, ein dam. So if the basar is not roy, lachtor, lachila, there's no dam. Then Rabbi Yeshua has a second pasuk, which is really the same pasuk, but the sefer of the pasuk. And he reads the next part of the pasuk, v'dam tzvachecha yishafech, v'habasar tochel. Why does the Torah say dam yishafech al mizbech and then v'habasar teochel? And Rabbi Yeshua interprets it as telling us that unless you can have habasar teochel, you cannot have v'dam tzvachecha yishafech. Just the opposite of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer reads it, V'dam zvachechi shofech, stop, and you could have a zrikas hadam independent of the basar, and afterwards v'basar teachel. We'll soon see that Rabbi Eliezer is going to derive from this sequence that you cannot eat the basar until after the zrikas hadam. That's a question of an isur and then a matir in sequence, but the main thrust of the pasuk according to Rabbi Eliezer is hadam yishafech even without the basar. So yesh dam below basar, but that's not how Rabbi Yeshua reads the pasuk. He reads it as dam zvachecha yishafech ve'abasar tochal, means that only if and when there's basar teachel, then hadam yishafech, and if ain basar ain dam, which means if you hold tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and you need the tzitz to be maratza because of the word dechuya, the concept of dechuya, then since the tzitz is not maratza ala ochlin, there's no way that we can bring this carbon because there's no zrikas dam without basa that's royal achila. There's no agent that can make the basa royal achila because the tzitz does not have the power to be maratza on the ochel. It can only be maratza on the carbon itself, but the carbon depends upon the basar, and the basar is tamei. Okay. So why do we need two psukim? We have number one, the pasuk v'abasar v'adam, and that pasuk v'abasar v'adam indicates that the dam that comes after v'abasar is royal zrika because the basar is royal achila. And then he has the pasuk dam zvachechi yishafech v'abasar tochel, which means that if v'abasar tochel, then dam zvachecha yishaf. So the Gemara answers chad bi'ola v'chad b'shlomin. Okay. Utzricha, we need to teach us the interdependence of dam and basar in both ola and shlom. If we only had one of the two, we cannot derive the other. How so? Because of Rachmana bi'ola. And now the Torah says that the zrikas hadam in the case of a korban ola depends upon the basar. And when we say basar here, we need basar lak Torah, right? There's no basar fachilas adam in the case of an ola kulo kolil. And there's a chumrah in ola that would not be applied to shlomim if we didn't have a second pasuk. In the absence of two psukim, if we only had one pasuk, and now the Torah is saying that there's no dam without basa, we would have limited that to ola. And in fact, the pasuk opens up by saying V'asisa ola secha ha-basar v'adam. So ha-basar v'adam, which creates this interdependence that there's no basar, there's no dam without basar. That's v'ola secha. We would have limited, if we only had one pasuk, to the case of ola. And what's the chumrah of ola? Ola hi the chamira sheken kolil, that the carbon ola is completely burnt on the mizbeach. There's no allowance for achilas adam. It's all achilas mizbeach, and that upgrades the carbon ola to a very, very high level. In fact, by the way, I would point out on the side that a guy can only bring a carbon ola. He cannot bring a carbon shlomim, because shlomim is a different kind of a concept that only is relevant to Jews and not to non-Jews. Aval shlomim b'lo chamiri, we don't have a chumra kuli high that in shlomim it's kolil. Shlomim is not kolil, so it's sort of like a partnership between man and God, in which God gets his emurim, so to speak. The mizbeach will eat those chalavim and evarim that will be brought on the mizbeach, and the adam gets his share of it, and that makes everybody happy. So that's a carbon shlomim, but it's on a lower level. It's not as chamur as an ola. Hence, the chumrah of an ein basar ein dam would be limited to a carbon ola. Now, why not tell me shlomim ein basar ein dam, and with a kal v'chomer I would derive ola. If you have a chumrah in shlomim, then it always applies to ola with a kal v'chomer. Ikas rachmana v'shlomim hava mina adarab. I would say that the fact that shlomim has achilas adam makes shlomim into a greater chumrah, which means that if you talk about the status of basar, in the case of shlomim, it has all the, you can check off all the requirements, all the conditions of an ola, plus, just like in the case of ola, you bring the basar on the mizbeach and the taktorah on the eish of the mizbeach. That exists even in shlomim. But shlomim has another kind of achila as far as the basar. The basar is now uplifted, upgraded to another status, because it has an additional mitzvah besides haktorah al gavi mizbeach. There's a mitzvah of achila. Now, is there a mitzvah of achila or not? That's itself a gigantic sugya. Then the Rambam seems to indicate that there's no mitzvah of achila shlomim in terms of the bailam eating the basar, but the briskers already say that what the Rambam means, it's not an independent mitzvah, it's part of the greater mitzvah of hakravas hashlomim. But be that as it may, with regard to the basar of shlomim, we have a double achila. We have the achilas mizbeach that gives the mizbeach its share, and then we have the achilas adam, and the adam gets his share in the achilas habasar. So the basar now, as in contrast to ola, give shlomim a very, very special status. The basar of shlomim, vis-a-vis the basar of ola, is on a very upgraded level. This be shtei achilos. Aval ola the less be shtei achilos. It only has the hakrava al gavi mizbeach, but no achilas adam. It's emalo. Perhaps the Torah did not upgrade the basar of an ola to the same status as that of a shlomim. Hence, in the case of an ola, I would have said that yesh down below basar, and for that reason, I need a second pasuk. And in that pasuk, the Torah says, "The dam zvachecha yishafech, ve'abasar tocher." And it's interesting because the first part of the pasuk is a reference to carbon ola, and that's explicit in the pasuk, ve'olasecha. But then the Torah repeats itself, so to speak, in terms of the interrelationship, interdependence of basar and dam in the Sefer. Why would the Torah repeat itself? And the answer is because now the Torah is shifting over to a carbon shlom. Is kamash malan. Therefore, I need two psukim, one for ola, one for shlomim, to establish the principle of him ein basar, ein dam. Okay. Let me just see if there was anything I wanted to point out over here. Gabi dinim ha nigmarim machmas habasar. Oh, he says in the note over here that it's clear from the Gemara that in Shlomim, since it has shtei achilos, that's a chumrah. However, the Ritva, not here in Pesachim but elsewhere, says that the fact that in Shlomim there are two achilos is certainly not a chumrah of Shlomim. On the contrary, the fact that in Ola is kreva kula, the ein kan achilas habaylim, that gives a certain chashivas and a mile and a chumrah to Ola over Shlomim, which the Gemara had in its original presentation. If we only had one pasuk about Ola, Hadam v'Abasar, we would have limited this chumrah to Ola because of the mila of Ola, Chikain Kolil. So he says that actually, as far as all dinim are concerned, Ola has on the hierarchy of Kodshim, is on a higher level of chumrah and mila than Shlomim. The only exception, he says, not for the Ikar Avoda, but rather as far as the dinim that are dependent upon the basar. In other words, if the basar is the gorem of the din, then the Shlomim is adifa because it has two achilos in the basar. Ubinidonenu shezrikas adam tluya basar, that we want to say that the dam depends on the basar. Shlomim now gets a special mila because as far as the din of basar and the itzer of dam, or shall I say the dependence of dam on the basar, is generated by the basar, here's where Shlomim, insofar as it has a double achila, its basar generates an iser or a psul in the zrika if there's no basar that's royal achila. Then there's another discussion here about Shlomim. What happens if a murim are lost or they became tamei, but the rest, the rebalance of the basar, which is designated for achilas adam, is still edible? It's not lost, it's not tamei, or the reverse. What happens if the achilas adam becomes impossible? That part of the korban was lost, but there's still an achilas mizbeach. And again, just to make a long story short, the upshot of it is that either or, as long as you have some basar, whether it's the basar aktara or it's the basar achilas adam, that's enough to apply the principle of yesh basar and therefore yesh dam. Zrika is valid even though we only have one of the two achilas. Now the Gemara says that we have a problem in terms of these drashos and these psukim, even according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Nami, let's ask another kasha, says the Gemara. Haksiv habasar tochel. In other words, why, according to Rabbi Eliezer, does the Torah say that v'dam zvachecha yishafech, and then it says v'habasar tochel, implying, as Rabbi Yeshua insists, that it's only because of habasar tochel, therefore dam zvachecha yishafech. In other words, habasar tochel is limiting the dam zvachecha yishafech that came before it. It's restricting and setting up a conditional that when is v'dam yishafech, only when it's habasar tochel. So Rabbi Eliezer is going to justify the simple, straightforward meaning of Vidam Zvachecha Yishafech Labasa Tochel by saying Ahumi Boile Shein Basa Mutvachila Ad She Yizrok Hadam. That the Torah wants to tell you that first Dam Zvachecha Yishafech and then and only then Vabasa Tochel, because the Zrikas Adam is matir the achilas habasa. So he says in the footnote, he says it beautifully. He says, Lo ba posuk litlos ezrikas adam b'achilas habosar. Rabbi Eliezer rejects the position of Rabbi Yeshua. El ba litlos es achilas habosar ezrikas adam. Interesting. When two things are written contiguously in the Torah, you can interpret it in one of two ways. It was A and then B. So it might be telling you that A depends upon B, or it might be telling you that B depends upon A. It's a one-way street. So Rabbi Yeshua understood that v'dam zvachechi shafech only if habasar tochel. If the bus is not royal achila, then there's no zrikas adam. So the dam is dependent on the basar. And Rabbi Eliezer insists that it goes the other way around. That A came first, v'dam zvachechi shafech, to set the dam up as an independent of basar. And a basar tochel means that only because adam yishafech, when the zrikas adam is existing, then it's matir habasar teoch. And this way Rabbi Eliezer reads the pasuk. She'ein ato yachol l'kayim habasar tochel rak asher kodmolo v'dam zvachecha yishafech. Okay. Now there's a very interesting sugya here, which is more relevant to Masechet Makos than it is to Pesachim. I'll just mention it because it stimulates the curiosity. What is the status of someone who eats basar? We're talking about shlomim before the zrikas adam. Rashi in Masechet Makos says that he violates an iser aseh, because the Torah says v'dam zvachechi shafech, and don't eat the basar until after v'dam zvachechi shafech. V'basar tochel only after you were makayim the essay of zrikas adam v'dam zvachechi shafech. So Rashi says that this creates an iser aseh of eating the basar before the zrikas adam. And the implication is that there would be no malchus for violating an Isra Aseh. However, there's a sugya in Masechet Makos on Daf Yud Zayin that darshans a pasuk in the parsha of Ma'aser Sheni. In Ma'aser Sheni, the Torah says Lo suchal lechol b'sharech, which means you're not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni outside the bounds of Yerushalayim. But the Gemara applies this to achilas basar kodshim kalin, meaning in a case of shlomim, if he eats the basar, kodem zrikas adam. So it's interesting that the kal v'chomer from Ma'aser Sheni, which is relatively kal, to kodshim, in this case, basar shlomim kodshim kalim, is going to teach me that just like there's a lotase, if a person eats Ma'aser Sheni outside Yerushalayim, there's a lotase if a person eats the basar of kodshim kalim before the zrikas adam. That the zrikas adam is like the sha'arim, it's the matir of achilas shlomim, basar shlomim. And the catch on Rashi is that it would seem from the sugya that if you eat basar kodshim of shlomim before the zrikas adam, you violate a law, and you would incur a chiyuv malchus. Not the way Rashi has it, that it's only an isra aseh of dam zvachecha yishafeh. So I'm just mentioning this this issue. There's a lot of literature on this. The Sfas Emes has a piece on this. And the question is whether Rashi saw perhaps a contradiction between our Gemara and the Sugyan Makos about Lo Suchal Lechol B'Sharecha, or perhaps what the Gemara meant to say, according to Rashi, is that from Lo Suchal Lechol B'Sharecha, which is allowed in the case of Ma'aser Sheni, we derive an Iser essay with regard to Achilas Kodshim Kal, Basar Kodshim Kal before Zrikas Adam. The Gemara now asks the following kasha on Rabbi Eliezer. If according to Rabbi Eliezer, when the pasuk says "V'abasa tochel," we're deriving that there's an iser of achilas basa shalom before. Zrikas adam is ema kulu lahachi u'da'asa. If that be the case, why don't we say that the entire pasuk is coming for this drasha, and what it says habasa tochel, and then it says v'dams v'chechi shafech, telling you that the basa teochel is only after v'dams v'chechi shafech. And if that be the case, then the entire thrust of Rabbi Eliezer's principle and his drasha goes down the tubes. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer derived from V'dams v'chechi shafech that Zrikas Adam is independent of the basar. And even if the basar is not roy lachila, there still is a Zrikas Adam. How can he derive that? When the purpose and the meaning of V'dams v'chechi shafech is to tell you that the achilas habasar has to come after the Zrikas Adam. Is therefore afal pishein sham basar minolan. How could Rabbi Eliezer apply the principle that dam is independent of basar, and even if the basar is not roy lachila, there is Zrikas Adam, and the carbon remains kosher without basar? That's not what the pasuk is telling you. The pasuk is telling you that only after the Zrikas Adam do you have a heter to eat the basar. So that what we're going to need here in order to defend Rabbi Eliezer is what we call tarte, mashmale. In other words, there are two diyukim in the pasuk, and we can derive two halachas, because if we only want to derive one halacha, the Torah could have said it a little differently. And the fact that the Torah said it this way means the Torah wants to derive a second halacha. Amalecha, so Rabbi Eliezer is going to say the following: that if the pasuk is only coming to be matir the basar after the zrika, and the basar is also before zrika, in Cain, the Torah should have said nichtav rachmana ha basar tochel v'hadar v'dams v'chechi shofar. So the diuk in the pasuk, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is the sequence. If you want to tell me that X is matir Y, then X should be written sequentially before Y. So it should have said habasar telchel. No. I'm sorry, just the opposite. It should have, if the matir is written in the same pasuk as the davar asur, then the matir should be written after the davar asur, telling you that this davar asur becomes mutter only after the heter. So the sequence should have been habasar tochel. You want to be matir the isra of achilas habasar. And then it should say v'dam shafech if and when the matir is in place and there was a zrika. And I'll prove it to you, says Rabbi Eliezer. K'dechsiv b'reisha. Look at the sequence in the beginning of this same pasuk. It says with regard to Ola, v'asisa lasecha habasar v'adam. That basar comes in the pasuk sequentially before dam. And we're going to learn from this that the basar is only eaten after the zrikas adam. So therefore, basar comes first, dam is second. Then we get open to the sefer of the pasuk. And the sefer of the pasuk says, v'dams v'chechi shafech, and then habasar tochel. And the sequence is just the opposite in the sefer of the reisha. So it couldn't be that the Torah is just reiterating that the basar and its hetel achila depends upon the zrikas adam, because if that were the meaning of the pasuk, then it would have again consistently, as it does in the reisha, present the achilas basar first to tell you that achilas basar is suspended until we have the zrikas adam. Is maishna de'akdeme dams v'checha? Why did the Torah in the Sefer, the second half of this pasuk, begin with dams v'chechi shafech, and then afterwards v'abasar tochel? It must be teaching me shma mina dam afal pishein basar shma mina in basar mutar b'achila ad sheyizrak adam. So it means that we're going to derive two principles from this pasuk, principle number one is dams v'chechi shafech independent of the basar, and that means that even if there's no basar, it's not royal achila. Nevertheless, there will be zrikas adam. And number two, we're going to derive from the fact that at the beginning of the pasuk, basar is mentioned first and dam second, to tell you that the basar is only mutter after the zrikas adam. And that's what we said before in the name of the Malbim, that it's a one-directional equation. And we're saying that the basar depends upon the dam, but the dam is independent of the basar. Now the Gemara turns back to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua says that the thrust of this pasuk is to teach us that aim down below basar. Rabbi Yeshua aim basar mutabachilat shizok dam minola, and I'm adding a word to the Gemara, meaning that now that we need this pasuk, according to Rabbi Yeshua, to be machmir, that the zrikas adam depends upon basar being roy le achila. If that be the case, from whence does Rabbi Yeshua derive that the achilas basar depends upon the zrikas adam? Do you follow? Again, if you have the two directions, it's pretty simple. In other words, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the direction is, and that's the thrust of this pasuk, that dam depends upon basar. If that be the case, you have no source from which you derive the conclusion that the basar depends upon the dam in the other direction, that the dam with its zrika is mat in the basar. And the Gemara answers kal v'chomer. Okay. Now this kal v'chomer is based on the principle of comparing the two achilos. We keep speaking about two achilos. We have a murim that are brought on the mizbeach, that's achilas mizbeach, and then we have achilas adam. So here's where we introduce a kal v'chomer. Uma a murim. Now the Gemara makes a gigantic assumption here, and it's all based on a sugya back in Talmud Nishchat. I'll just mention quickly that sugya in Talmud Nishchat, which I teach in my next class, but I mean, we did it months ago. And the Gemara establishes there that in a case of mechusar kapara, like I'll give you an example. Let's say a Mitzorah, his seventh day of Tara coincides with Yudalid ben Nisan, and he desperately needs to bring his kapara, his karban, in order to allow him to eat from the karban Pesach, because a mechusa kapara, even though he went to mikvah on the seventh day and he's pretty much tar, but he's not completely tar until he brings his karban. The problem was that they already brought the tamid shel bein arbaim, and there's halacha that we don't bring another karban, with the exception of karban Pesach. We bring no other karban after the tamid. So this fellow, Mr. Mechusar Kapar, is in a real bind because he desperately needs to bring his karban in order to be mater him, in order to allow him to eat from the karban Pesach. He doesn't want to miss that opportunity. It's a mitzvah sheish bo karetz. But on the other hand, we cannot override the iser of bringing a karban after the tamid shel bein arbaim. In any event, the Gemara over there goes through a whole analysis of how, under what conditions we could allow the mechusa kapara to bring his karban even after the tamid, how we can tiptoe through the tulips and figure out a recommendation to do so. And at the end of the Gemara says that even though he will not be able to eat the basar of that karban, in other words, if we allow, with whatever combination the Gemara offers there, with a chatas of and so on, if we allow him to bring his karban after the tamid, The problem is that carbon is not royal achila because he's mechusa kapara at this point. And the Gemara says that we're going to equate it with a case where the emurim were lost. And the halacha is that if the emurim are lost, the carbon still remains kosher. So that night, after they do the akrav of the carbon pesach on the 14th, that night of the 15th, he'll be able to eat from the carbon pesach because his carbon was brought even though the emurim are so-called lost. It's not that they're physically lost, but they're considered as if they're lost. Anyway, the bottom line, again, we don't have to do a review of a very complicated sugya back on Daf Nun Tes, but we have to know that with regard to emurim, if the emurim are lost, the carbon still remains kosher. So here's the Kal Vachomer. Uma emurim dechi lesnahu. Lesnahu means that they were lost or they contracted tumah, so there's no possibility of being makriv the emurim loma akve. So that if, let's say, it's a carbon shlom, and a carbon shlom, as we said over and over again, has two achilos. It's got the achila of the emurim of the mizbech and the achila of the bailim, achilas adam. If the emurim, which is achilas mizbech, is impossible because they're lost or they became tameh, nevertheless, the carbon shlomim will be nechal. The achilas adam is not dependent on the achilas mizbech. Kiyas naihu. This is a special compensation. No, that's not the word. Not compensation. What's the word I'm looking for? Okay, dispensation, is that a word? Right? This is a special matir because since there's no possibility of a murim, you can't be matir because the murim are lost, they're gone, they're tameh. We're going to allow the achilas habasa, but that's only because the murim are not around. If the murim are around, then there's no achilas habasa of achilas adam in Shalom until the emurim are brought on the mizbeach. So it's interesting. On the one hand, the emurim and Nachtaras emurim is the matir of achilas basar in the case of Shalom. Achilas adam is permitted as a result of the achilas mizbeach, but that's only because the mizbeach is waiting, is demanding its portion. If that portion doesn't exist in the world, as far as the mizbeach is concerned, then you don't need the matir of aktaras emurim vis-a-vis the achilas habasa. The achilas habasa remains independent of the achilas mizbeach of the aktaras emurim. And this, by the way, just a footnote, is a very fundamental principle in halacha that sometimes X is necessary as a precondition for Y, but that's only because X is possible. For example, all of our gerus today, the whole institution of gerus in our time, is based on that principle. Because back in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there was no gerus without avos hakarban, which we're going to derive not this Shabbos, but in two Shabbosim around, with the gerus of Matan Torah, they had to bring karbanos. But today that we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, the Gemara says the karban is not miyakeh. Anyway, getting back to our sugya, the Gemara says that if the Amurim are gone, lo ma'akve, they're not going to be ma'akiv the achilas habasar, but nevertheless ki isnahu, when the Amurim are available, they're not lost, they're not tummy, and they're available for akrava, you can be makted them on the mizbeach ma'akve, then you cannot eat the basar until after the aktaras emurim. The aktaras emurim of achilas mizbeach is going to be matir the achilas adam, and this is derived from almost a black and white pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin. The pasuk says v'ktira kohenes hachelav hamizbecha, and then v'hoya chaze li Aaron ulabanav. In Shlomim we give the chaz v'shok to Aaron, but only after v'hiktir hakohen esachelev hamizbecha, and the kohenim can't eat. They are enjoined from eating the chaz v'shok until after the haktoras hachelev hamizbecha. However, Again, that's only because there's a possibility of bringing the chaylev hamizbecha. If nevdu o nitmu, then the basar is mutar b'achila, even without daktora sachalova, because it's impossible to bring the emurim on the mizbeach. Now we get to dam. Dam dechilesa. However, in the case of dam, we don't have this principle of, well, if the dam is there, then we could be matir the basa. But if the dam is lost or it became tameh, we're going to allow the achilas habasa. That doesn't exist in the case of dam. So with regard to aktarsi murim, the Torah has kaviyachol akula, and it allows the achilas habasa even without the aktarsi murim, in an event that aktarsi murim is impossible. But with regard to dam, if it's not roy lizrika, it's mi'akev, and you can't eat the basa. Again, the Gemara here does not spell out exactly why this is so. I mean, theoretically, but again, what I'm telling you is totally wrong. So, dok v'tishka. Theoretically, in a conceptual world, you could have said that the dam is necessary for the achilas basar if there is dam, but if there's no dam, then there would be achilas basar in the absence of dam because there's no dam. But again, the pasuk says v'asisa olasecha habasar v'adam, and Rabbi Yeshua derives from that ain dam ain basar. The truth is that even Rabbi Eliezer, who rejects Rabbi Yeshua, that's only as far as im ain basar ain dam, but he agrees that im ain dam ain basar. So the principle that basar depends upon dam is unanimously accepted. Nobody questions that principle. And when a carbon, you makdish a carbon, it's also achila. And the matir is going to be the kaparas habayla, which is dependent totally upon the zrikas hadam. The zrikas hadam engenders the kapara. And until there's kapara, the carbon is also achila for sure, whether it's the kohanim or the bailim. And that's what we call mishulchan bavoah kazachi, which means the zchus of the bailim and the zchus of the kohen to eat the basar is engendered by the kaparas hakarbon, which depends upon the zrikas hadam. It's therefore ki isa lo kol shkein dema'akev. Oh, so let's go back to the drawing board. The Gemara said the following, that according to Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that the pasuk is coming to teach you that in ein dam below basar, meaning that the dam needs the basar. If the basar is not roy and the dam is not nizrak, how does Rabbi Yeshua derive the conclusion that the basar itself is only mutar b'achila after the zrikas hadam? And the answer is he's going to derive it from a murim, since the basar of achilas adam depends upon the murim, and how much more so the basar for achilas adam depends upon the zrikas hadam. I don't need a pasuk for that, because since the Torah says with regard to chazav v'shok, the Torah says v'hikter hakonis hachelev hamizbecha, and then the kohen could eat the chazav v'shok, which means that aktarsi murim is the matir for achilas adam. That be the case, how much more so would the dam be matir the achilas basar? And without the dam, there's no matir. And how do we know this? Says the Gemara from a kal v'chomer. Because if a murim are necessary when they're available as a matir, doctora, as a matir for achilas adam, how much more so dam, which we know requires the actual zrika, how much more so is it necessary to be matir the achilas habasar? Now we have a question on Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that the sequence of the pasuk of dams v'chechu yishofech, and then v'abasar tochel is coming to teach you that you can't eat the basar unless you first was zorik the dam. The zrikas adam is mati v'chilas basar. Why does Rabbi Eliezer need a pasuk for that when you have a kal v'chomer? If you need the aktar say murim to be mati the achilas adam, how much more so that you need the zrikas adam to be mati the achilas adam? And the Gemara answers, Milsa the Asya b'kal v'chomer, Torach b'karachla b'kosav l'kra. The Gemara says, well, Rabbi Yeshua is also very smart. He knows that Milsa the Asya b'kal v'chomer, Torach b'kosav l'kra. So then, how does Rabbi Yeshua square with this drasha? And he answers, Kol heichad ikol midrash tar shinon. In other words, if there's an extra redundant word in the Torah, and there's a possibility of being darshaning it, and your other option is to derive from a kal v'chomer, then what we're going to do is we're going to use the pasuk to darshan something else. Now the Gemara asks the following question. Now we're back to our Mishnah. Hashta. Now that we've clarified the machlok between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, lema masnisa the lok Rabbi Yeshua. Our Mishnah is against Rabbi Yeshua. And why is that? The came of the Omer be'inan tarte. Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion that in order to be makriv a carbon, you need both zrikas adam and achilas habasar. It has to be bas that's royal achila. And now you're being makriv a carbon tzibur bituma. And since we're holding tuma dechuya b'tzibur, we need a ritzit tzitz. V'tzitz achilos lo meratza. The tzitz does not have the power to be meratza on the achilos to make it into a royal achila situation when it's tamei. Is heichi asi bituma? How is it possible to bring a carbon bituma? It's literally impossible. You're in a maze. You're like a trap here. There's no way out because we're holding him ein basar ein dam, and we're holding that you need a tzitz to be maratza, and unfortunately the tzitz is not maratza on a davar necha, on that which has to be eaten if it contracts tumah. He writes here, Hare Kevon Shenitma Habasar, V'ena Tzitz Maratza Olav, Hare Ein Kam Basar Roy, Uladas Rav Yeshua, Ef Shalisro Gesadar. So that Mishnah, our Mishnah, which says that you're makriv a carbon v'tumah, it's against Rav Yeshua. Now here, there's a Tosfos Nema, which is on Omid Aleph, Nema Masnisa. Turn back, you'll see it's the third Tosfos up from the bottom of Daf Ayin Zayin Omid Aleph. And he says the following, that if we're holding now the tum is dechuya b'tzibur, and therefore you need a tzitz to be maratza, and tzitz is not maratza ala ochlin, he says the following, is the Gemara happy, is the Gemara okay with reconciling our Mishnah with Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that there's Rikas Adam, even if the basar is not roy, it's not around. Frektosis, the Mishnah says that in the case of Shtei Alechem, if Rovat Tzibur are Tameh, then we will bring the carbon that accompanies the Shtei Alechem. Now, in the case of Shtei Alechem, there's no part of the Shtei Alechem that is Karv L'Mizbeach. Now, we're holding that Einat Tzitz Miratz Ala Ochlin. And if that be the case, then how is it possible to be makriv the Shtei Alechem when the tzitz is not meratz ala ochlim. I mean, the whole karma goes down the tubes. That's the kash of Tosfos. Now Tosfos asks another kash. He says, how can the Gemara say that this Mishnah is against Rabbi Yeshua when the Mishnah itself, which we didn't get to the seif of this Mishnah on Daf Ayin Ches, the Mishnah says that all korbanos, with the exception of Pesach, im nitma basar v'achelev kayim zokim esadam. Right, Pesach is the exception because if the basar is tamei, then the whole purpose of the korban Pesach is undermined because Pesach is for the purpose of achila. So it means that ilu nitmu habasar ve'hachelev ain't zarkin es hadam. So again, you're talking about a case of nitma basar, and the Mishnah is telling us that in the case of korban Pesach, since it's nitma basar, we cannot be zorik the dam. Doesn't that reflect the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, who holds him ein basar ein dam? So the Mishnah, which holds that there is a korban that's brought be tzibur if rova tzibur is tmeim, that Mishnah itself is Rabbi Yeshua. So he says that the Gemara knew that this Mishnah has to be reconciled with Rabbi Yehuda. The kasha of the Gemara is, if part of the Mishnah doesn't seem to work out with Rabbi Yeshua, then we can't work out the seif of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yeshua. The Gemara answers, Afilu Tamer Rabbi Yeshua, even Rabbi Yeshua could agree that there is a korban haba b'tumah. So Rabbi Yeshua tzitz meratza al ha'olim. In other words, that when we say that the tzitz is not meratza al achilos, we're talking about achilas adam. But as far as the olim, as far as that which are maktir on the mizbeach, on the murim, then the tzitz is meratza. So that even though I agree that if ein tzitz meratza ala ochlim, and therefore im ein basar ein dam according to Rabbi Yeshua, but nevertheless, when we say that the tzitz is not meratza ala ochlim, that's only on al nechal li adam. But as far as that which is ola laktor al gabi mizbeach, the tzitz is meratza. So that means it's as if the emurim never received tumah, they never contracted tumah, because the tzitz is meratza on the emurim, and therefore we have we can apply, I would say, the principle of yesh basar v'yesh dam. Why? Because the basar, at least the emurim, is royal in its back. We could be zorik the dam. Again, the basar itself is not nechal, but that which lends itself to aktar al gabi mizbeach, namely the murim. Here we have ritzi tzitz, and that's enough to say yesh basar, and therefore yesh dam. So we could be zorik to dam. He says, af shal basar nechal ena tzitz meratza, dai ba meshu meratza al ha-imurim, shekedei lizrok es adam. Again, I don't know how this is going to apply to korban Pesach, but at least other zvachim, I understand what the Gemara is saying here. Shekedei lizrok es adam dai bekach sheyesh chelev haroi lakrova. A kezayis for akrova is enough, or a kezayis for achila is enough. But here there's no possibility of achila because the tzitz is not meratza on achilas adam, but it is meratza on achilas mizbeach. So we have a kezayis chelev that could be burnt on the mizbeach. That makes it subject to zrikas hadam. Oh, so I just realized that the answer to my question is in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that nitma basar v'achelev kayom zorkin es adam v'chol hakarbonos chutz v'pesach. Okay, good. Nachadaiti. I was wondering how the Gemara is presenting the independence of the basar le haktar al gav mizbech, meaning murim, from the basar l'achilus adam, and we justify, according to Rabbi Yeshua, even the bringing of the carbon bituma based on the fact that the murim were subject to the ritzui tzitz, even though the basar adam is Eino Necha because Eina Tzitz Maratza. And I was thinking, how could that apply to Korban Pesach? But the answer is that the Mishnah itself says, Kol HaZvachim, Kol HaKarbonos Chutz Mi Pesach. So the Gemara asks the Kasha, Ha Tenach, Zvachim. We understand very well all the zvachim that are listed in our Mishnah, but the word zevach means a carbon that is burnt on the mizbeach. So nicha zvachim deika olive, so that we could have a ritzitzitz on the part that's burnt on the mizbeach, which is the olive, the imurim, and that makes it basar roy. But ela omer shtei lechem, the leka olive, ma'ikal abema. So let's take the case of the omer, right? The omer is called a carbon mincha, and a carbon mincha requires kmitza. And kmitza in a mincha replaces rika in a zevach, in a behemoth. So now, in the case of the minchas ha'omer, we have a case of tumah, and the Mishnah says that we could be makriv b'tumah. And again, according to Rabbi Yoshua, we could only be makriv b'tumah if we have basar haroi. So how can we do the kmitza of a minchas ha'omer? You've got to have something that's royal achila. Let me just see if he adds anything here. He says, "Hakometz b'menochos hu keneged adam b'behemos kshem b'behemos omer Rabbi Yoshua she'ein zorken es adam elim kein yesh dvar ma'ru'uya b'karban adam and the basar is mochen gabi menachos tzarich sheyeh od chelik roi milvad hakometz." Because the kometz is burnt on the mizbeach, there's got to be something else. Alchein minchas ha'omer shenitma'a eina tzitz meratza rak ala kometz, right? The kometz, the part that goes on the mizbeach, v'lo ala shirayim. There's no ritzui tzitz that could, so to speak, be entire. That part of the mincha that was not included in the kometz, the balance of the mincha, we call it shirayim, is efshar lahakarus hakometz. According to the logic of Rabbi Yeshua, we would not be able to be makta the kometz of the mincha, because as far as the ritzui tzitz is only vis-a-vis the kometz, but not on the shirayim. Let me just see if I have this. Again, in a case of a zevach, we have the emurim and the tzitzis meratza on the emurim, but we don't have any parallel in the case of a carbon mincha with regard to the shirayim. If the shirayim contracted tumah, then there's no ritzui tzitz. Just 1 second. There's no ritzui tzitz on the on the Shirayim. So again, you need Roy Lachila, like in the case of Basar, and here the tzitz is not Maratza on the Shirayim. Let me just, I know we're running out of time, so I'm a little under the gun here, but just to read the next line in the Gemara to see if maybe my problem is going to be the Gemara's answer. Amri, Ki Amar Rabbi Yeshua Nami, Davin Tarte. So we need Zrika Saddam and we need the Basar to be Roy Lachila. Is that's only Bizvachim in a Behema for a carbon Aval, but B'Menachos Lo Omar. And Benachos, Rabbi Yeshua be moded that the Kometz is Karev, even though the Shirayim are completely out of the picture because they contracted Tumah. So in the case of the Minchas HaOmer, all we need, even according to Rabbi Yeshua, is that the tzitz would be Maratza on the Kovetz, and therefore the Kometz is Roy Lakrava through Ritzui Tzitz. And now we're going to have to see how that works out in the case of Shtei Alechem. So B'li tomorrow we'll review this last piece, and we'll take one step further. I'll make a note of it that we go beyond Omer and we apply this logic to the Shtei Alechem. Okay, then. So let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a great day.